the idea of socially engaged scholarship is to have a kind of scholarship that's being produced together between communities and academics that is socially useful. That isn't just a scholarship that sounds flowery and sounds beautiful and is very nice to read, but it's actually practical and useful in the real world in helping to face and solve many of the problems that we have in our communities. And I think that's why this series is very important to us here at MOJA. So this is, as I say, it's the third. The first, Ivor Batches, who's with us, actually did the very first webinar on this topic of socially engaged scholarship. Then we had Enver Motala, who is also with us, together with Irina Senecal, gave the second webinar on this subject. And today, we are fortunate to have Yao Graham from Ghana with us, who's going to present, I should say, the third and the final one for this year in our series of 3 presentations. But even though we're coming to the end for this year of this third presentation, with this third presentation, we will be starting up in the new year again, exploring the subject. So we're not going to get to the bottom of everything today, but we're going to learn a bit from each other and discuss around this important subject. Yao, I think rather than me presenting you, maybe you can, as part of your presentation, maybe you can shortly present yourself at the start of your presentation. So people are familiar where you're coming from and who you are, if they don't know you already. And then we'll start on the presentation, as I said, on the political economy of adult education in Africa. This is a very important subject, and this is a great opportunity for us to learn more about it. So thank you very much. I have no further ado. I'll hand over to you, Yao, please.
Okay, good morning to you all, and it's a real privilege to be invited to speak in this webinar. Through my old friend Enver Motola, I was invited to speak in this, and the topic, as defined, is about the political economy of adult education in Africa. But I must say that, as a disclaimer, that I am not an expert on adult education, or specifically on the political economy of adult education, but I have done a lot of work and do a lot of work on the political economy of development in Africa, and which really is a context within which the issue of education and adult education sits. So I saw this as a chance also to connect those discussions with the problematics and the challenges of adult education in Africa. I am going to, my presentation today will, let me just now project my screen. Just give me a minute, please, yeah. Okay. Do you have my screen?
Yes, we can see it, Yao.
Okay. So a little bit about myself. My name, I work for an organization called Third World Network Africa, based in Accra, Ghana. And we work as a Pan-African organization, work for social and economic equity in Africa and equity for Africa in the global order. We've been around for 30 years. We're actually celebrating 30 years of the creation of the organization, and we forge partnerships, across the continent. And one of the things we do is to support the self-organization and expression of people affected by policies, in addition to the work that we do ourselves to intervene, in policy advocacy. specifically on the subjects that I've been invited to speak about. First, what I'm going to do is just situate this thing, the fact that 2024 is a year the African Union has declared to be a year for improving education. It is part of the many things that the African Union has put on this agenda. But it's important to situate that initiative also in the challenges that face education on the continent. I mean, in terms of education, I think we know that there are issues at virtually all levels of education. But the starting point really are the ideologies and visions that drive education, which connects with the analysis I'm going to offer, because I think what we face with Education Africa is very much rooted, in the choices of kind of neoliberal economics and the vision of neoliberal development of society. So the challenges that we face around issues like access, around issues like quality, issues like funding, the growing privatization of education, the growing reduction of education from a public good to it being seen as a private gain, and also the value placed on different kinds of education, including adult education and continuous learning, and its very great erosion around the African continent is really something which can only be understood in the context of the ways in which the education has evolved, since the late 80s and early 90s. And I know that in the case of South Africa, although South Africa, ended apartheid in 1994, some of the same processes of transformation of education as something important for society, all aspects of society for a variety of purposes, have really also begun to shift in the direction of being seen primarily as something of producing people for the market, and also people gaining skills for their private benefit, as opposed to education in its totality as something that allows citizens to strengthen their civic capacity and to be engaged, as citizens all over. So what I'm going to do then is basically situate. So this is the context within which this is the reality that we face. But my argument here is that the political economic context, as it has evolved over the past 30 or so years, it's very key to what the situation and the challenges that we face in education and with adult education. So I'll do the background of the economic crisis, which led to liberalization. The last 20 years in Africa's economies and societies, particularly the commodity boom and its effects, the political liberalization and the creation of what I call choiceless electoralism, and more recently, the debt crisis and its socioeconomic crisis, and finally, looking forward around questions of, the alternatives that we face, the implications of the climate emergency for Africa's economies and societies, and therefore how those things will shape any discussion about education and adult education, specifically. The main context, starting point of my thing, really, how we came to be here, has to do with the global economic crisis of the 70s, which led to certain responses. The wider crisis, of course, was global in terms of the crisis of global capitalism. In the African context, being a primary commodity export-dependent continent. And what do I mean by this? Most African countries rely on a small basket of primary agricultural and mineral economies for their export. And the structure of their economies are primarily determined by this mode of insertion, into the global economy. So when prices of these goods fall, of course, then it has a knock-on effect across all the rest of the economy and society. And between 1970 and 2000, the global economic crisis meant that the terms of trade, in terms of what what Africa got for its exports and what it cost Africa to import the manufactured commodities that we don't produce, basically there was a decline in the continent's ability to its earnings and therefore its ability to import and also to support domestic expenditures. So of course, what it meant was that according to the World Bank, what was lost was equivalent to more than about 120% of Africa's gross domestic product. Now, for any economy to lose that amount of value was bound to be a crisis. So all the crises that we had, which led to structural adjustment, really came primarily from this economic fact. Why is it important to underline this? Because the narrative, the dominant narrative, particularly comes from the global north, is about African incompetence, it's about African corruption and mismanagement, which led, to this crisis. Of course, we have a lot of mismanagement and corruption, but primarily the crisis was due to structural, issues, which also were linked also with the fact that colonialism bequeathed us with economies which were dependent on raw materials with very little manufacturing and other sectors. So that loss meant that there was the loss of value, of course, meant that there was very little money to invest. Things began to get run down, and the African countries became desperate about, what to do with these in this situation. In that context, actually, because of the global nature of the crisis, there were discussions about responses. On this PowerPoint, I put two categories of responses. On the part of the global north, the US and its allies, we know that the late 70s marked the beginning of neoliberalism, when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan instituted, liberalization and privatization in Britain and the US, which became the norm for the global north, and then eventually was exported to Africa through the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and IMF, and also bilateral donors. But parallel with that process, particularly in 1974, developing countries actually tabled and got adopted in the UN General Assembly a proposal for a new international economic order, which basically argued that the global economy was not fit for purpose, particularly because it didn't serve developing countries, and it needed to be reformed root and branch. Because this would have required, it was a power issue, and it's not a surprise that the dominant powers did not accept this framework and didn't get very far. What happened in practice, of course, was that the Bretton Woods institutions, in exchange for lending to African countries, imposed their framework. The key document in this regard was something called the Berg Report, which the World Bank put out in 1981, the Accelerated Development in Sub-Saharan Africa, an Agenda for Action. Around the same time, African governments also were trying to set up a framework for responding to the crisis. So in 1980, African governments adopted the Lagos Plan of Action, but it didn't get very far because basically they could not resource it. So the question of how to finance Africa's development was put in very stark, context there. In 1990 also, African governments put forward the African Alternative to Structural Adjustment programs. Again, that didn't get very far because already many countries had adopted structural adjustment. Just to give an illustration of what was going on, the primary export sector was very important. So the World Bank developed a specific program called the Strategy for African Mining, which became the framework really that was used to liberalize mineral regimes across Africa. And this was very key because restoring Africa's export of raw materials to the world was seen as a key objective of structural adjustment. Many of you probably know the effects of structural adjustment policies. A sweeping, which was adopted across the continent and really most of the global south. But it led to basically economic liberalization and deregulation driven by the Bretton Woods institutions and Western donors. These institutions became very dominant in domestic policy making. The program restored primary commodity export as a primary purpose of African economic activity. It discouraged industrialization. It also privatized a lot of things, commercialized public services and public goods, including health and education, and also reoriented public expenditure away from public goods towards commercial provisioning, and also reorganized education and this curriculum to focus on basic education and providing skills for the market. I mean, so this framework really is where it all started, and also therefore what was deemed important, as a component of education in our countries. So the relative reduction of the importance of continuous learning and adult education across Africa, which really you find was part of the package of many post-colonial governments, has gone out of the window. The University of Ghana, for example, has repurposed its adult education program now as part of its distance education component for the award of degrees. And a number of other universities in Ghana that used to do this have also done that. We used to have a non-formal education scheme, which has completely disappeared. And I'm sure, many of you can speak to that experience, in other countries. Now, but as structural adjustment wore on, what we had, thanks to the emergence of China as a major economy, was that there was a huge boom in demand for primary commodities. It's important to underline that when the Western institutions were liberalizing and opening up African governments, the assumption was that their companies would be the primary beneficiaries. But it so happened, of course, that with these liberalized economies were now accessible to all powers, and China was the main beneficiary. And Chinese demand for raw materials was very key in the commodity boom, a commodity boom which led to the revitalization of African economies. In fact, between 2000 and let's say about 2013, the commodity boom was responsible for the best growth in Africa since the crisis that I described earlier. This slide shows you just how much the demand for minerals was in China, and how this from 2000, if you compare where the demand got to in 2007, you can see that Chinese demand really as a percentage of global demand was very key, in the commodity boom, which kind of redynamized African economies. Of course, this was also accompanied by the inflow of Chinese capital into African economies, and China becoming a leading player in all kinds of areas. There's also the geopolitical dimension, which is very much current in terms of the West versus China, which is a factor in African economies and politics, but that's something we could pick in the discussion. This slide also just illustrates the dominance of China in mineral resource consumption and what it meant for the redynamization of African countries. This demand was reflected in price shifts. I have a slide here which shows you how prices moved compared from 1950 to on the way to about the 2000s. You could see the ways in which commodity prices moved up once the Chinese demand began to enter the thing. This is another slide which has taken a few commodities. It's taken gold, copper, aluminum to show how the demand for these minerals changed. If you look from 2000, you can see that the demand shot up very sharply. And of course, these are commodities which are very important in African economies. Gold, important for Ghana, South Africa, and others. Copper, of course, is very important for DRC and Zambia and a number of other countries. So these movements were very important for the growth of economies. This is just another slide showing the way in which mineral prices moved. Crude oil, very important for a number of countries. You can see the way the price moved. This is just another representation of that price movement. And of course, the biggest beneficiaries of these price moves, the increase in demand and the increase in prices, were the transnational corporations who own the mines in Africa, because liberalization has allowed them to take over the privatized mines and to have very generous terms within which to exploit the mineral resources in Africa. And this slide just gives you the figures that, for example, between 2000 and 2000 between 2005 and 2011, the profits went up by a phenomenal 2005, 2007. Private profits for some of the top TNCs went up by 1,400%, and they grew over a 10-year period at an average of 20% a year. And of course, the effect also was that the ownership of mines in Africa, and therefore mining capital in Africa, was increasing in the hands of foreign companies. This pie chart here gives an idea about, you know, the ownership of copper mines, of mines in Africa. This gives you an idea about who were the main players, all primarily Western firms. Now, the boom led to a growth and increase in public revenue and so on and so forth. So I've given examples here of how gold prices went up. So in Ghana, gold export values went from just under $800 million to more than $5 billion in a 10-year period. The price of copper quadrupled. Oil prices, you know, reached an all-time high of 140-something%. However, these were not terribly beneficial, because poverty actually in Africa became, the number of poor people increased, even though the percentage of poverty, of hardcore poverty, actually increased in the period. Inequalities grew because of the nature of this growth, and inequalities worsened. The growth really was not an economy-wide growth, but was concentrated, you know, in a few areas. And although there's an addition to public revenue, it was suboptimal because most of the benefits were actually being exported by the companies. So these non-renewable resources, even though there was a boom in exploitation, did not inure to the benefit of African citizens at large. And in the area of agriculture, the expansion of agriculture as part of the commodity boom for export commodities, alongside mining, for many citizens, there were negative impacts: land dispossession, negative environmental impacts, loss of livelihoods of affected communities, violence and human rights abuses, there's corruption and misuse of public funds. So although there was growth, this growth was not transformative, and also it didn't substantially improve the lives of many people. Unemployment remained a problem, exclusion remained a problem. But one of the things I did, though, was to intensify the dependence of African economies on primary commodity exports. Now, the implication of this, therefore, is that really African countries became even more vulnerable to the cyclical movement of commodity prices. This map gives you an idea. The red shows you the intensity of commodity dependence, and it's worst for the oil exporting country. But you can see that the continent as a whole, in a way, that red we can take as a metaphor for vulnerability, you know, to commodity price movements. Only a few countries, you know, have what I might call kind of integrated and balanced economies, which, you know, relatively speaking, would not be shaken by commodity price movements. These slides just illustrate the point a bit. Of course, in the boom period, African countries began to borrow because there's money available from private sources. The sources of bilateral borrowing had diversified. It was no longer only Western economies that could lend. China could lend, Turkey could lend, Brazil, and so on and so forth. So African countries went on a borrowing spree the result, though, is that when interest rates began to go up and commodity prices came down, Africa had a huge debt problem. And that debt problem has become a factor now in the continent's development prospects and its ability to invest in needed in industrialization and also in public and social services. Currently, 25 countries spend more on debt servicing than they spend on education. And 32 countries spend more on debt servicing than they spend on healthcare. So the debt has become an issue in the prospects for development on the continent. And of course, the power relations generated around the debt also means that the creditors now are able to determine, a policy in many countries. The youth routes that we are seeing in many countries really can be linked directly to the squeeze, that countries are facing. This graph, this table gives you an idea about the types of debt. The blue band is for the private debt, which has become a very important part of the continent's debt, because the private debtors are the most demanding, because unlike the government lenders and the multilateral institutions, they are not susceptible to domestic political pressure in what they choose to do. So this really, it's a very important factor now. And we know that when austerity is imposed, the sectors that get cut in general are the social sectors. It also means that the possibility for transformative investment, which benefit ordinary people, would also be among the first, to be dropped. Governments then become driven by trying to make foreign exchange to pay back debt, which leads to the intensification of the primary commodity export and the perpetuation of the kind of the economic structures that we have, which are very much the root of the development challenges and maldevelopment that our countries face. Of course, the debt has been driven by a number of things. As I said, exuberant borrowing, because governments assumed that the commodity boom was going to continue. We have low savings. Public revenue is very low. There's also weak accountability for the borrowing, the use of the money. And then there's a volatility of commodity prices. There's also the issue of the leakage of economic value through the very liberal terms that foreign direct investors enjoy. And more recently, the downturn in the economic climate because of COVID-19, which closed off economies, and of course, the impact of the war in Ukraine, Russia, created a particular global context. Because the debts are denominated primarily in dollars, when interest rates went up in the United States, it meant that the servicing terms also for African countries became even more exorbitant. Now, all these economic issues that I'm discussing are being managed within a certain kind of political context. Political liberalization in Africa from the 1990s was a very important development, a positive development away from the authoritarianism that characterized the preceding period. But we know that the social relations of power, the nature of the African state, is kind of reflexive authoritarianism, was not transformed overnight. So what we have seen over the past 2 or 3 decades really has been the continuation of the kind of the underlying political economy that I've just described, overlaid with electoral processes, which have basically created a mechanism of intra-elite circulation in power without offering, alternatives in terms of the future of the countries. And I think that in almost all our countries, this has become an issue because we have choiceless electoral systems. I use the word electoralism rather than democracy, because democracy speaks to a much wider, set of values, not simply the thing to free expression and organization, but really socioeconomic rights and people's conditions, which tend to be dismissed when people talk about democracy. There's a focus on the first generation of rights, but that is the right to the expression and so on. But for us in Africa, I think the issue of social, economic, and cultural rights are also an important part of the agenda that we should be talking about. But those are increasingly under threat, and ruling elites are committed to the model that many people are finding satisfactory, and the electoral political system is not offering a way out. Now, so where we are now means therefore that really, the issue of development alternatives have become very urgent, and the development alternatives, of course, cover the whole gamut, not of the the nature and structure of our economies and moving away from primary commodity export dependence, what some people would describe as extractivism, towards development models that create opportunities for people and also allow sustainable development where sectors of economies in Africa are connected. And in the African context, this is not simply a thing to be viewed at the national level, because colonialism left countries defined by accident, according to the logic of colonial interest, so that regional approaches to development are very critical in the African context, because some of our economies, quite frankly, are suboptimal in terms of scale for any serious development. So regional approaches are very important. There's a rediscovery of the importance of structural transformation and industrialization in the African context. That's been spoken about, but really to be able to do that, we also need to look at the thing beyond the nation state level, and also to begin to look at industrialization, which takes account of the implication of the need to transition from fossil fuels. So addressing the climate emergency really has to be seen as a developmental and transformation challenge. For African countries, of course, there's a specific issue that many of the fossil fuel exporters are facing fiscal crisis and the stranding of the assets that they depend on. For mineral exporting countries, there's going to be increased demand for those who have the endowment to produce critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, manganese, aluminum, copper, those things, graphite, nickel, and so on. We've seen a new competition over these resources. The recent example of the United States and its allies offering to build a railway from the Benguela corridor from DRC Zambia alongside an existing Chinese railway shows the perverse consequences of how this competition is going to play out. And that competition has to be factored, therefore, into how we in Africa begin to integrate that global pressure into our conception of development. Otherwise, we'll simply be replicating and expanding, the externally driven logic of development, which was from colonialism, which has been perpetuated by our primary commodity export dependence. So, as I said, the climate emergency really is framing the development challenge in a number of ways. And that has to be taken on board, because in the countryside, we know that the climate emergency has had consequences in terms of the people's livelihoods, in terms of the cycles of the weather and predictability. Some of the huge movements of people and migration that we are seeing really are attributable to the climate emergency. The other issue that I've just looked at is the fact that the unfolding shifts in the global economy and power relations. Literally, the sun is setting on the west and is rising in the east. How do African countries position themselves in this issue of shifts in the global economy, which is expressing itself also in the crisis of a number of key global governance institutions? The paralysis in the UN is an example. In the World Trade Organization is an example. The importance, therefore, of African collaboration and acting together is very critical. And of course, the issue of the political regime that prevails and in our countries will be key for how we engage with these challenges of transformation and alternatives, which puts the issue of the crisis of democracy in Africa as a central issue, because it's through the issues of governance that the choices are going to be made about whose interests are being served by the use of power, whose interests are being served in the way we respond to these various challenges and so on. And ultimately, therefore, the starting point for a way forward is how citizens engage. And that active citizenship, that activism must be founded also on knowledge of the realities that people are living with. And that knowledge of the realities people are living in links directly also with the business of continuous learning and adult education and the wider education system as a whole. Because the way what people know and learn is so key for how they see the world and therefore how they perceive change and what are the problems that they face. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yao. Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. And Enver, you're with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, well, Enver, are you going to lead us in the discussions?
Well, I was hoping that we'll get a lot of questions, but anyway,
Sure.
let me say, I found the presentation to be brilliant and extraordinarily informative because of the breadth of its compass, setting out exactly what is the logic, shall I say, the illogic of the development, which has, in a way, which has actively destroyed the possibilities for real development on our continent. And it provides the underlying motive force for that in the way in which Africa continues, and most countries of the world in the South, in fact. So this the analysis provided by Yao is relevant not only to Africa, but I suppose it is relevant to nearly every country in the world, which has largely been a site for extractivism, for a site for the rapacious appetites of multinational corporations seeking to get raw materials at the lowest possible price, regardless of the consequences for the people. And yeah, there was a particular slide there, which showed the actual effects on the ground, the material effects of what these neoliberal, extractive, exploitative strategies have meant for the people of this continent in every area of social life, poverty, hunger, employment, health, education, you name it, everything which goes under the name of development. But the other thing that struck me about this presentation is the fact that regardless of the many, many global covenants, the SDGs and the role of many multilateral institutions whose mandates are ostensibly about development, despite all of that, in fact, nearly everything has turned into dust, has turned into its opposite because of the extraordinary nature of the undemocratic regimes of global control. I mean, I particularly, therefore, liked the analysis which shows a huge difference between electoralism and democracy, and what genuine democracy really means, which is about engagement. And I think, the MOJA webinar series on engaged scholarship or engaged thinking really is this is exactly what it's showing to us. And the end point, of course, is quite simply that we can't continue to rely on external interests, whether they be in the West or now in the East, for African development, because unless it is autonomous, unless it is alternative, unless it is solidaristic, and unless it is focused on development of human beings, of the people and the environment, and the ravages of these processes, mining, manufacturing, and other processes on our environment, nothing is going to change. And so the idea that, Yao's proposition that in the recent 30 years past, we've had nothing but elite reconnecting or reorganizing of the elite amongst themselves on this continent is, of course, the big challenge which we face. So I want to leave it at that, but I want to ask Yao one question for him to expand more on what he said, because there is these days some idea that in this, because there is a polarity, global polarity developing, there are at least two poles now in the world, unlike what it was, say, at the closure of the Soviet Republic, where there was one single pole in the world, essentially around the US. Now there is some suggestion that there is a bipolar or a multipolar world. Well, really, I think one needs to think more carefully about what that world means for countries like the countries of Africa, which in some ways have become fair game for the competitive urges of both worlds. Although I have some friends who seem to think that somehow we have to support the idea of a multipolar world because it, in a way, it dents the extraordinary ascendancy, the hegemony of Western global interests, Western multinational interests. So I'd like a comment from Yao on that particular issue. But otherwise, all I have to say is thank you very much, Yao. I think this is exactly what we needed to hear, and I hope there are questions which will be put to you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks. Quick response to the multipolarity thing. I mean, there are at least two elements. Now, the dominance of the US and its allies and the growing challenge of China, both of these, of course, are fed by their international relations. The accumulation that made Western capitalism what it is for the US to become hegemonic without the surplus from developing countries will not be, the US and its allies will not be where they are, as well as the markets they get access to and so on and so forth. China has also benefited from that, from markets, access, the returns from its export of capital and so on. So in a certain sense, that fight also, we are implicated in it. So being able to develop means also the extent to which we're able to define our own agenda and implement it, which is why I talked about the importance of acting together, in a regional context. But having said that, I mean, in the global economy, global interaction, global and multilateral spaces, processes around trade, capital flows, decision-making in arena like the WTO, those really will remain part of it. So for me, the issue boils down to how do African countries as a collective position themselves to advance their interests amidst the contradictions and fights among these powers. It is not in our interest to be a partisan of either party, because the US and its allies are looking out for their interests. The example I gave of those two railway lines competing from DRC to the Atlantic coast is illustrative. From an African point of view, it's perverse to have two railway lines, but they are going to be built because of this competition. So how we define our own interest, where, for example, in that context, Zambia, DRC become poles where Africans are discussing how the copper and cobalt endowments of those countries are beneficially used for those countries and the Africa region. Then that becomes a platform from which you deal with the West or with China or with anybody else. And those things are possible. Too often, African frameworks have been defined at the formal abstract level, but national regimes, which are in the pocket of different powers, subvert what are objectively in the interests of Africa's people. So that will be my thing, which takes it back, therefore, to the closing point I made about the fundamental importance of politics and who are in power and the vision that is driving development choices.
Thank you, Yao. I'd like to open up the floor to, we have a lot of people here who we haven't met and haven't heard from. Maybe you have some questions you'd like to ask. If you do, please raise your hand. I know we have a lot of people working in adult education. And I see Abdullah, have you raised your hand?
Yes.
Abdullah, please go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to Mr. Yao for this presentation. I learned a lot. Somewhere he said that 25 African countries spend more on debt than education, and 30 more on debt than health. I would like him to clarify to us, why do they spend reimbursing debt, whereas they are not providing quality education and health to the population? And if it is possible to have the list and the number of these countries per region, I mean North, East, West, South Africa, and if possible, it is possible to have the list of these African countries, if it is possible for him to share the list of these African countries with us. Thank you.
So, Yao, did you get that request?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Okay, and how do you respond?
Yeah. As far as the list is concerned, it's something that has to be shared, later, because that's a kind of a summary. But the list I can find that for both categories. One is 25 countries, one is 32 countries, health and education. That can be shared later. Why do the countries spend more on health and education? Well, it's very simple. First of all,
you mean on debt, Yao?
On debt servicing. On debt servicing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, debt servicing. Because you borrow, you have a contract to pay for the debt. There are consequences. If you don't pay, you are deemed to be in default. Default basically triggers consequences of your not being able to access new credit, or people may even sue you to recover what is owed to them, and so on and so forth. So the systemic consequences for default are huge, okay? And there's pressure from outside. If you notice, when countries like Ghana and Zambia have gone, which have defaulted, I mean, Ghana defaulted, the government has taken steps to assure creditors that the debt will be paid through cuts in public expenditure. The IMF and World Bank come in and say, we'll lend you money, provided you can reach agreement with your creditors. Education and health, which are expenditures coming out of the public budget, legally speaking, are discretionary choices being made by government. Anytime a government draws up a budget, it makes discretionary choices. I'll spend more on this, I'll spend more on this. Which is what I talked about, the thing about the ideology that drives development choices. But in this case, governments faced with this kind of crisis, it's easy to cut things which they feel they have no obligation, there'll be less political pressure to. If, for example, they decide to stop foreign companies exporting their earnings, they've signed up to allowing companies to export their earnings immediately to trigger consequences. So there's the legal regime around credits, around debt, the legal regime even around foreign investments, in a way, are more constraining of how our governments behave than the obligations that they feel towards us as citizens.
Okay, thank you very much, Yao. Do we have Abdullah? Does that yeah, Yao, if you do send us here at MOJA, if you send us these lists that Abdullah is talking about, we can make sure that it's distributed to everybody. Definitely. Do we have any more hands in the room? Ivor,
Yes.
are you?
Yes. Hello, sir.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to appreciate Mr. Yao for his informative presentation. His presentation focused on the economic aspect, actually. I love to see how this economic influence is changing the education system, in particular, adult education. You said the economy is booming in Africa. Yeah, it is booming, but what is the share of education? Is there any significant contribution of African education in its economic development? You have said also in the previous time, African education and economy was colonized by the Western. But now there is a change, particularly when China is taking the lead. Our economy is more or less connected to Chinese influence. So do we expect now from Chinese to change the education system of this the African continent in general? In what way China can support the education system of the continent? Otherwise, if Chinese are looking only for mining, then we cannot improve ourselves, whether we like it or not. This is true. We are running, for example, to catch up with industry, to technology, but now we are also running for AI. So can we get any benefit from Chinese influence in the current condition, particularly in the education system? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Yao, do you have any response to that?
Yes.
Please.
First, the thing about a booming economy. I made the point that the commodity boom led to growth. There's been a downturn in terms of commodity prices. So actually, the growth that we saw about 10 years ago is no longer at that level. Okay. But I also made the point that the growth, the quality and distribution of the growth was not transformative. And also the utilization of the inflows were driven by the ideologies built around neoliberalism and the interests of ruling elites. So there's no logical link between, for example, the growth in revenue. At an extreme level, take a country like Equatorial Guinea, small population, loads of income from oil. It's a clique of family and cronies who control all that resource. Take Nigeria, what they've got from oil over the years and the phenomenal level of corruption and waste. Look at DRC, which is a scandal. They say it's a geological scandal, but the governance there, it's a joke. You take South Africa, rich country, but inequalities have actually worsened, since the end of apartheid. So the growth, economic growth, there's no logical thing to benefit unless conscious policy choices are made. So I just want to clarify that. And expenditure on education, as well as the type of education, because again, you can have expenditure, high expenditure on education, but it can be improperly allocated. The expenditure can be inefficient. There can be gaps. So in Ghana, for example, the government has introduced a free senior high school policy. Now, the idea is laudable, but in practice, it's been a disaster because it's not been well thought out. So it's taking a large chunk of the education budget. No preparation was made for training of teachers. It is still based on a boarding system, which is ridiculous because you cannot put millions of kids in boarding school. So there are so many flaws in the design. So therefore, the investment is wasted. So whilst many African countries have actually increased expenditures on education, I mean, it is clear that the problems remain in a number of ways because there are other factors also which influence, for example, whether kids in rural areas will go to school. I mean, if their parents have no resources, they are malnourished, they may not go to school, and so on and so forth. So the point here is that booming economy does not necessarily lead to equitable outcomes in terms of economic benefit. Increased availability of resources does not lead, even in education, does not lead to improved choices in education. Even within education, the expenditures may not be optimal in terms of how the needs of the country are defined. On China, first point to make is that our economies remain controlled by Western capital. It's important because whilst Chinese influence is growing, I'm yet to see an African country where the economy is dominated by Chinese capital. The Chinese are influential in certain sectors in particular African countries. China is Africa's biggest trading partner. They are selling a lot of raw materials to China and importing a lot of manufactures. So in that sense, China has become a very important player in African economies. But when you come inside the economies, it's a different area. The intermediaries in this trade, export of raw materials or import of manufactures, is the transnational mining companies, which are not dominated in Africa by Chinese firms, who are exporting the raw materials to China. Okay, so we need to break down again the political economy of each sector and the relationships within it, who is benefiting and who is losing. Okay, the Chinese are interested in African markets to sell their manufactures. They are interested in African resources, raw materials. They're also interested in exporting capital to Africa through lending, through their development banks, and so on. And China is also exporting labor in places like Ghana and some other places. Increasing numbers of Chinese are migrating as artisanal and small-scale miners, or even as petty traders competing in the informal economy with Africans. But there's not one African country that is dominated by China. And I think we must correct this because Africa has to work out the challenge that China poses for it and define an attitude based on Africa's interest, not to get caught up in the Western representation of the problem that China poses for Africa. Because when you look at the way the China problem for Africa is presented, it is presented from the West as an extension of the fight, the geostrategic fight between China and the West. That is their fight. We as Africans must define ourselves in relation to the West and China. We want to loosen Western control over our economies and societies. And we certainly do not want the Chinese to step into those shoes. That's the nature of the problem. What can we get from the Chinese? The Chinese increasingly, of course, they are leaders in various areas. In the same way that once upon a time, the United States learned from Britain as a leading industrial power and transformed. Japan and the other Asian countries learned from the rest, Germany, and so on, and transformed. We also should be looking for lessons from across the globe, including China, which until yesterday had the largest poverty problem in the world, but has overcome it. What lessons are there for us to learn from those countries, which we adapt for ourselves? What lessons to learn about what not to do? That really is an approach. But to look to the Chinese for solutions to our education, I would flip it around and say, what can we learn from them, which we can adapt? What can we learn from them that we want to avoid? A similar question in relation to other experiences.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Ivor, are you with us?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Ivor, are you there? I'm just
Yeah, I am here, David, but I see that there is also a question in the
Okay,
chat.
so I don't see any hands at the moment. Sorry, maybe I'm in the wrong place. Please, okay, I don't have any hands at the moment.
Yeah.
What is who's waiting to ask a question?
May I ask a question?
Can you please raise your hands electronically so we can see you when if you would like to ask a question?
David, there's a question in the chat, which I don't know how we...
Abdullah again at the moment. Is that,
no, there's a question about what do you see any role for...
in the chat, yes.
Adult learning education.
In contributing to
inclusiveness, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, very much so.
How would you like to address that one?
Yes, very much so. I mean, because when I look at the work that we do, particularly, you know, with the workers' movement in mining affected communities and so on, the issues that come up around what I've been trying to present in this webinar point to an important role for adults learning and education in inclusiveness. I looked at the presentation that Ivor made in the last October's ALE conference, okay, and some of the presentations. And quite clearly, in terms of those processes or mechanisms, as providing the ways in which to include more people, to widen engagement and knowledge around these questions that we are talking about. So therefore, to strengthen civic engagement. Obviously, this is quite important. You know, I have a recollection when I was a child. My grandmother, this was in the Nkrumah period, my grandmother and people were doing literacy, but it was also around this, the Nkrumah's government had adopted what they called the 7-year development program, what they call the Work and Happiness Program. And teaching people about the Work and Happiness Program was part of the adult education and literacy program of the Nkrumah government. And they also had newspapers in local languages put out by the Ministry of Information regularly, which was distributed free to the population. And I remember in primary school, we got copies of those local language newspapers given to us as a way to encourage, you know, reading and literacy. Of course, I didn't kind of theorize it like that at the time, but looking back, that was the way that it worked. And all those things have disappeared. And I think clearly there's a place for them, particularly in this discussion about the kind of overcoming the issue of the choiceless electoralism that we have and making alternative choices.
Thank you.
Hello?
Okay.
Okay, I see a lot of hands. Maybe we start with Hassana. I see Hassana Kanambaye. I see your hand is raised. Please go ahead.
Maybe you should unmute.
David, I thought Yao.
Voilà, donc,
Okay.
bonjour.
Yeah.
Moi, c'est Hassana Kanambaye de Bamako. Je suis journaliste et président de l'Alliance des journalistes pour la promotion de l'éducation au Mali, AJPM, et travaillant au fond de MOJA. Donc, je vous ai écouté dans vos communiqués et vous avez mis l'emphase sur l'éducation aux États-Unis et leurs alliés, plus précisément l'éducation chinoise. Je voulais savoir, est-ce qu'il y a une éducation typique pour l'Afrique et qu'est-ce qui convient précisément à nous, Africains, surtout par rapport à l'éducation des adultes? Merci, c'était ça ma préoccupation. Si la question est bien saisie, j'attends la réponse. Merci.
Okay. Thank you. I got the Yao, did you understand the question?
Yeah, I heard him. Whether basically I think there's a specific education for Africans. I mean, the issue of what is African itself is contested because there is a diversity in Africa. And although there are some commonalities, those commonalities, I mean, are defined by our shared histories and experience of colonialism. And also the fact that, I mean, whatever may be the specific, some of the specific elements of our societies, some of there are common elements defined by that history. I mean, I make this point because the logic of how cultures are defined have a lot to do also with the material conditions in which people live. They are not wholly determined because there's an interaction between material conditions and ideas and so on and so forth. So between Ghana and Mali, for example, there are common elements that are unavoidable. So in all our countries, colonialism has left national languages and a tendency not to try to develop and use local languages. This is a common challenge that all our countries face. There's a thing about gender relations. Patriarchy is a common problem. In quite a few of our countries, traditional leaders claim and exert powers which reinforce patriarchy, but also at the same time represent a blockage to people enjoying their rights as citizens within a society. So a culture of people being constituted as subjects rather than as citizens flows from this mix of patriarchy and certain ideologies around traditional rule. Our economies are very dependent on a small basket of commodities. This is a common development challenge. Mali, in terms of its resource endowment, cannot go alone in the West Africa region. Okay. Some of the factors driving insurgency in Mali, poverty, exclusion, and so on, are all present. So the challenge, for example, of integration and developing a shared identity so that the diversity does not become a point of conflict and divisiveness are common challenges that we face. I've given a very long answer to the question to show that the issue of building consciousness and education has to be constructed specifically, but also highlighted some of the common elements that go into defining this reality. I mean, living in Ghana, you find that many Africans in the diaspora come to Ghana because of its history as a point where slaves were exported. Many of the African Americans, when they come here, they are disappointed at how they are received because they are coming back expecting to be treated as fellow Africans. But when a lot of Ghanaians encounter them, they can see that they are Black, but race is not the only definition of identity. When they hear them and look at how they carry themselves, many people see Americans.
Okay, thank you very much, Yao. Yeah, and see that, okay, have to, also, I hope that has answered the question. Have to, I see your hand is raised.
Okay,
Please.
thank you. Good afternoon. Hello.
Please go ahead. Yeah, your microphone is muted. Can you please unmute your microphone?
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, my name is Hafsa Burhan and I'm from Ethiopia. Thank you, Moja, for organizing this session and Doctor for presenting this amazing session. I have two questions actually, and the first one is with historical background of adult education. If I have to take one experience of my country, there was a huge experience of adult literacy campaign in the 1980s, and in terms of access, I can say that it was successful because the illiteracy coverage was very little in terms of, if I have to compare with the previous experiences, but yet, in recently there is a program of IFE, Integrated Functional Adult Education, which is yet unsuccessful due to low attention to the program and commitment from the government bodies. Having this in mind, what do you think is the way out to make the program more relevant and accessible? And my second question is in terms of integrating ICT to the program, the education program, and bring a change in digital literacy. Who is responsible and what is there are stakeholders, different stakeholders, especially from NGOs. So what are we expecting from them? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Haftu. Yao, did you get those questions?
Yes, I did.
Okay, would you like to respond, please?
Well, I mean, let me say that I'm not a specialist in, in adult learning and education. This question throws up some very specific issues, which really is of a specialist type. So it would be a bit arrogant for me to claim to be able to address it, although I appreciate the question. Maybe there are other people on the call who can venture, an opinion on this.
You prefer to? Okay,
David,
please.
can I say something? Well, I see Ivor's got a. If you can direct Yao to Ivor's questions, they are in the chat. I don't know if Yao can see them.
Yeah, yes, I see those, but Yao is now directing this question that was just asked by Haftu to the group and to somebody maybe who is more involved in adult education group.
Well, I was going to say Ivor might be able to actually deal with the question which was asked, but there's also a question by him.
Okay, thank you. Ivor, how about Haftu's question first, in relation to how we integrate, well, let me see, how the historical background of AE, how we fight literacy, how we integrate, whose responsibility is it? Are you with us?
Hi, David. Sorry, I think I may have missed the question. Can you just repeat it? And I'm not sure whether I am in a position to answer the question anyway.
Okay. Well, I think he was asking, generally talking about whose responsibility is it? How do we integrate adult education better, or integrate these themes that we're talking about into adult education better? But along with that, maybe you could give your opinion as well before we look at the other question you directed to Yao. How is all of this? We're talking about the political economy of Africa, which is a very big place. How does this all fit in from a point of view of socially engaged scholarship? Why should we be concerned with the political economy, and how is it affecting our education?
Well, I think it probably then relates to my question, David, that I'm actually putting to Yao, because I know he claims that he's not a specialist, but I think he's already hinted in his presentation that there's resistance to the political economy within societies, and that resistance obviously takes different forms depending on where you are located. And it's often through, so if I have to answer the question that was asked, I would argue, based on the South African experience, the forces, the internal determinants of adult education had been social movements, the workers' movements. It was brought on through the radical tradition of adult educators who were directly experiencing the implications of the political economy on their daily existence. So I think we often think about the political economy as some force of nature. It comes and there's nothing that you can do about it. But it is not actually true. You can see how communities, how formations, especially social movements, play an incredibly important role in challenging the dominant ideology that comes. So Yao's point about, in the African Union is talking about, improving education. But you can see what it is that they are actually privileging. They are privileging skills for the formal labor market, for the economy. But social movements, civil society organizations are challenging that, and they're saying that human capital theory, for example, is highly problematic, and you need to start looking at alternatives. So I think one should not, and I hope I understand what the question was, that we should not think that we should hand over the responsibility to incorporate adult education and adult learning, that should be handed to the state. But I think civil society organizations in all its different forms should play a critical role in shaping the kinds of adult education that we think is necessary in order to build the kind of society and the political economy that would be of better use for peaceful, democratic society. So that would be my response.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivor. Yao, Ivor is somehow putting the question also back to you, but also in the chat he's saying it's clear that adult education is deeply implicated in the political economy of states and countries. And I'm wondering about your thoughts about the pockets of hope in our societies that we need to use and strengthen as part of a strategy to shape the political economy in a more meaningful way. And secondly, from your talk, I think there is clearly an opportunity, urgency for academics and activists to play a bigger role. Do you have any thoughts about this?
No, I agree entirely. I mean, because if we take a definition of the adult learning and education in a broad way, there's a lot of work that happens in the course of the mobilization of social movements, which is building consciousness, which already represents a junction with a more kind of formal process of adult learning and education, which of the type that Abo is talking about, involving civil society organizations and so on, in terms of changing so as to contribute, to change. I mean, I came out of the political movement in Ghana, and we decided to set up Power Network Africa to have a vehicle for a certain kind of work. So when people say, "Oh, are you guys a think tank?" we said, "No, we are not a think tank. We are a collection of activists who are working as intellectual activists to also support the self-organization and expression of people." So constantly, this is what we try to do. So we support the building of social movements around issues. And in that process, of course, consciousness building and learning takes place. What I'm learning myself from this encounter with the discussion about adult education is precisely the point that Ivor makes. How can we more consciously construct those kinds of relations? My wife, it's an academic, also an activist, and she's leading some work on social policy in Africa, triggered by the impact of COVID. And they've done studies in a number of countries. And when I was doing my reading for this event, and I was speaking to her, I said, "You know what? I've looked at the reports that you folks have prepared about social policy in Africa, and I looked at the sections on education. One glaring omission, which struck me, is that there's no discussion about adult learning and education in what you have defined as education. So maybe you need to do some supplementary work, okay, for this your 30-country research. It's a big research project to bring in the importance of adult learning and education. I'm just used to illustrate the ways in which these connections can be made, not simply at the level of people engaged in social movements and transforming consciousness, but even how the research agenda of progressive scholars need to bring this thing back in. And the lack of attention to that shows the success of a certain ideology and practice around education, which has taken hold, over the past 30 years.
I think, Yao, you're definitely preaching to the converted here, because I think as adult educators, we're very aware of how it is often marginalized in many agendas, not just the research agenda. Anyway, I saw that Umaima, you had your hand raised, but it's down now. Did you have some question? Umaima is gone, perhaps. I see Abdullah, you have your hand raised for a long time. Sorry.
I'm here.
Yes.
Did you have
okay.
Sorry, Umaima, did you have a question that you raised your hand?
Yeah, I raised my hand because there is a participant that put a question in French, so I just want to translate it.
Yes.
Okay, so sorry for that. Yeah, so it's a comment, and she said, it's Miss Fatoumata, and she said, if I understand correctly, one of the factors contributing to poverty is the arrangement of multinational corporations at the expense of other non-poor countries or other poor countries. So she's like just looking for explanation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Umaima. Abdullah, please.
Yeah, thank you, Yao, for your, good analysis on how African economy is politically taken by others, controlled by others. You specifically talk about the case for China, who is even bringing his manpower in Africa to take over, the economy of Africa. My question is that how adult learning and education can be used as a mean or a way forward to put an halt to this situation, to make sure that, because most of the population in Africa, they are not even aware that the Chinese or the other Western countries that are controlling the economy of Africa. So how we can use adult learning and education as a tool to make sure that an halt is put to this situation. And my question to Ivor is to know if Africa adult learning and education scholars or academics have any concrete plan, to make sure that the population of Africa is fully aware of this situation. We can say that one of this plan is today's webinar, but beyond this webinar, is there any plan from the adult learning and education scholars, academics, to make sure that the population of Africa is fully aware of this situation and that is against the future of their own countries? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Abdullah. Okay, there's a two-part question, and time is really getting away from us. So I think this will have to be our last questions before we ask Umaima, who has a short presentation, just 1 or 2 minutes. Yao, how would you, or Ivor, which one of you is going to start here?
Let me just, I think the Fatoumata's thing about the role of transnational corporations in draining resources from Africa, it's an important thing, because the most important sectors of Africa's economies are dominated by foreign transnational corporations. That's just the way it is. So, and the trade rules and investment rules that our governments have adopted makes life easy for them, whether they are from China, from France, from Europe, from Britain, wherever, or from Brazil. And to come back to Abdullah's question, and I will repeat something I said the first time. The primary challenge we face in this country, in Africa, there are 2 dimensions. One, to free the continent from the domination of Western capital, because Western capital dominates Africa, and to prevent others, including China, from becoming part of that domination. I make a distinction in terms of saying becoming, because one of the things which is striking about the ways in which we discuss domination is that colonialism has normalized the domination of the West. It's part of everyday life. So when in Mali, you see a French person, you can have a chat with that French person. You've been seeing them for hundreds of years. In every village in Mali, they've seen somebody from Europe. It's normal. So the domination is internalized and is normalized. The Chinese, not only do they look different, they speak a language we do not comprehend. So I argue that at that point, the perception of the China threat becomes mixed with xenophobia. There's very little xenophobia towards white people in most African countries, even though they are more influential. And I'm not arguing for xenophobia, but the Chinese face xenophobia, which is disproportionate to the influence they have. It's just like if you go to South Africa, the lynching of other Africans. These are poor people. Poor South Africans take out their frustration on other poor people from across Africa. So it's important that we focus on the essence. So there's a challenge of overthrowing Western domination and preventing others joining them to deepen the domination of this continent. So the adult learning and education thing starts with demystifying what we have taken as normal, Western domination. That's a primary challenge. And related to that, why therefore we should not allow the Chinese or anybody else to become like the West. That will be how we formulate the problem that Abdullah has put forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Okay, before we pass over to Maima, who's going to give a very quick presentation about the MOJA platform, Ivor, what have you got planned for the future of ALE and solving all our problems?
David, I think that question we must leave to President Abdullah to lead us. I think, Abdullah, the reason why we have invited Yao to talk to us is because we don't think that as adult educators, irrespective of where we work, whether we're in universities, whether we're in civil society organizations, wherever we may do our work, I don't think we can understand how adult education can be a powerful vehicle in the transformation of our societies if we don't engage with the political economy of the state. So I think what I would like to propose, and this is something that we can all consider, is that because I think we already almost 2 hours that we are talking, so it shows you how important this topic is. So for me, and I'm glad that David has said that this is the beginning of a conversation and something that we can pick up on in 2025. So I think it might be really interesting and important for us to continue this discussion about the political economy and it shows again for me how important it is for us to think across disciplines. To talk to Yao. Yao says he's not an adult educator, but the more you talk to him, his adult education has become alive. So I think it's important to have these conversations with our political economists, because I think it will enrich our understanding. For example, it can help us engage with the question, why is the state not funding adult education in the way that we all want it to support it? If we don't engage with the political economy, I don't think we will understand the funding models of adult education. So I would say let's think ahead about how we can continue the discussion about the relationship between adult education and the political economy. So that is my proposal, and we can ask MOJA to plot an additional series, because I definitely think almost an educational program for ourselves as adult education about the political economy is critical.
Great, thank you very much, Ivor. Okay, we really, time is running away from us, so I'd like to ask Umaima to give a very quick presentation about MOJA. This will be in French, so if you can switch on choose the appropriate channel in the interpretation. If you don't...
David, can I just, before that happens, can I simply apologize? Firstly, let me say thank you. As you know, I have to get somewhere else by exactly in 14 minutes. It takes me more than that to drive to the university from here. So finally, also to say thank you very much to MOJA, and thanks very much to Yao for doing this on our behalf. We hope MOJA will call on on Yao again, as I was suggesting, to deepen our understanding of the relationship between education and the political economy. And I'd like to apologize, and please excuse me. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Enver. No apology needed. Thank you very much. We'll come back and do a quick closing just after Umaima gives us her short presentation. Thank you, Umaima. Hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, David. So, hello, everyone. La présentation sera en français, donc voilà, je vais me présenter. Je suis Umaima Kefi, je suis chargée de communication régionale Afrique du Nord au sein de DVV International. Et aujourd'hui, je vais vous présenter la plateforme MOJA. Donc, MOJA est une plateforme en ligne pour les professionnels et les praticiens de l'éducation des adultes en Afrique. Elle est destinée au secteur public, au secteur privé, à la société civile et le milieu universitaire. Donc, ce que présente MOJA, c'est un lieu de création de liens et un lien d'accès à une multitude de contenus au profit du continent et de sa population. Et les avantages de faire partie de cette communauté et d'avoir accès à des informations d'apprentissage et de l'éducation des adultes, y compris des articles, des nouvelles, des liens, des ressources faciles à rechercher. Vous allez aussi trouver des profils d'organisation, d'apprentissage et de l'éducation des adultes et ça facilitera les échanges entre vous. Il y aura aussi des événements liés à l'apprentissage et l'éducation des adultes, comme celui-ci d'ailleurs. Ce webinaire s'inscrit dans notre programme d'événements. Il y a des webinaires, il y a des séminaires, des conférences, des offres aussi d'apprentissage en ligne. Quoi d'autre? Il y a des fonctionnalités interactives qui permettent et encouragent la discussion et le partage et la collaboration. Il y a l'échange de perspectives et d'expériences ou de pratiques prometteuses de toute l'Afrique et c'est un lien pour tous les praticiens de l'éducation des adultes dans tous les pays de l'Afrique. Donc, on va parcourir ensemble la plateforme MOJA. Il suffit d'écrire www.mojaafrica.net, rechercher ce lien ou bien tout simplement scanner le QR code qui est ici pour accéder à la plateforme. Donc, la plateforme se présente comme ceci et pour s'identifier, il suffit de trouver le bouton juste en haut à droite. Donc, pour s'inscrire, c'est juste facile. Comme vous pouvez voir, vous pouvez remplir ce formulaire et devenir membre de cette plateforme. Le tableau de bord se présentera comme ceci et après ça, vous pourrez ajouter vos événements, vos ressources, vos articles et partager vos expériences avec tous nos adhérents. Donc, ceci est un exemple d'article. Par exemple, c'est très facile. Il suffit de copier ou d'écrire directement sur la plateforme, mettre aussi une photo et partager avec l'ensemble du groupe. Donc, MOJA est une communauté de professionnels et de praticiens de l'apprentissage de l'éducation. Elle vous assure une grande visibilité et elle vous permet d'échanger des connaissances entre vous. Donc, c'est une communauté et vous pouvez profiter vous-même et votre organisation pour contribuer et partager des idées sur notre plateforme. Alors, pour cela, nous comptons sur vous, d'abord pour vous inscrire sur MOJA parce que c'est très facile comme vous venez de le voir. Et participer à nos événements, participer aussi à partager avec nous des articles, partager aussi vos expériences. On organise bien sûr des séminaires comme celui-ci, on compte sur vous pour participer à nos séminaires et apporter votre expérience et point de vue, pourquoi pas. Voilà, nous espérons vous voir aussi nombreux la prochaine fois et on vous remercie pour votre attention. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Umaima, for that very speedy and considerate presentation. Okay, I'd like to thank everybody for your wonderful participation. Most of all, Yao, thank you to you for presenting to us today and enlightening us on this very important topic. I think everyone has some idea about this, but there's a lot of information that people need to have more of. And as adult educators, we need to be aware of this information so that we can pass it on to others as well. And as Ivor has spoken, this is not the end of this discussion. Yao, you're one of us now, so we know we'll be inviting you back to join us for sure. And I just want to say thank you very much for being with us today, and thank you to everybody for your participation. And I hope to see everybody for the next webinar again. This is our last one for 2024, but we'll be back again in the new year, and we hope to see all of you then. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.